In the beginning of this chapter, I had mentioned that this feature called Save for Web actually originated as a full application called ImageReady, but that Adobe converted it basically to some kind of a plugin that works within several of its design applications, for example, Illustrator and Photoshop. Well, in this movie specifically, we're going to start to see a lot of those kinds of settings and features that really show that Save for Web is a full-blown application. Now, in this case here, I have a file open. It's called pagedesign.ai. And you can see that I've already designed this web page, and I'm now ready to actually save all this information. So I want to go through the different settings that you can find inside of Save for Web and Devices. I'm going to go to the File menu. I'm going to choose Save for Web and Devices. That brings up the dialog box here. And let's say I've already specified all the proper settings for my slices. So now I'm ready to go ahead and click on the Save button. That brings up the Save Optimize As dialog box. It looks pretty innocent on its own, but there are three pop-up menus down here that kind of change everything. First of all, where it says Format, you can choose to export just the images. You can choose to export only the HTML, or you can actually export a full page that contains both HTML and also all the necessary images for it. Now, depending on your workflow and where you're actually taking this content after you leave Illustrator, will determine which of these settings work best for you. For now, I'm going to leave it set to images only, but as we go through the additional training that we'll find throughout this entire video title, we're going to learn about using a variety of these different settings, and we'll see when they all make sense. If we come to the bottom menu over here where it says Slices, I can choose to export all the slices in my document, only selected slices, or as we'll learn about later on in another chapter when we focus more about slices specifically, we have the ability to export just the user slices. This actually gives us a tremendous amount of control around how our artwork is actually exported out of Illustrator. You know, there are some times where we have slices that have content that we need, where sometimes there are certain slices that are just not necessary. So we'll see that we can easily have Illustrator export just the slices that we need. For now, I'm going to choose Selected Slices. And then I'll come to this middle pop-up, and this is really where things change. Right now it says Settings, Default Settings, but if I click on this pop-up and I choose Other, that actually opens up an entire new dialog box called Output Settings. Notice, by the way, this is kind of interesting from a user interface perspective. I was in Illustrator, and I chose Files, Save for Web and Devices, and that brought up the Save for Web and Devices dialog box, which is this big window. I then clicked on Save, which brings up the Save Optimized As dialog box. Then I click on this other option, which brings me to yet a third dialog box. So we see now that we have all these kind of nested modal dialog boxes that we're working with, and this really shows that this is a full application that Adobe just kind of stuck here into Illustrator, and we have a tremendous amount of power here to work with as well. You can see from this pop-up over here that we have four separate things to kind of think about. How we want HTML to be written when saved out of Illustrator, how we want our slices to be saved, how we treat background images, and also how we ultimately want to save our files. So let's take a look at all these settings right here. First of all, in the HTML page, we have the ability to output XHTML. This is actually going to be useful when you want to export CSS also from Illustrator. For now, I'm going to leave it unchecked, and we'll see that we have a variety of different ways to format the HTML as well. You know, some companies or some developers are very specific about how the code should be written, and this gives us the ability to choose how the tags are written, all lowercase, mixed case, or all uppercase, for example. We have the ability to choose a variety of different ways to indent the text or the code that Illustrator creates. And if we come to the bottom, we can also see that Illustrator, for example, will always include comments, include alt attributes, so on and so forth. If we go to the next tab right over here called Slices, we'll see that we can actually export our slices as a table using HTML, which is kind of the old way of doing things, or we can actually generate CSS, which is the newer and preferred way of doing things. And in fact, later on in this video training title, we'll discuss specifically how to take the CSS that's written by Illustrator and bring that into Dreamweaver. You also can choose the exact way that Illustrator actually names the slices. By the way, this is only going to come into play if you don't go ahead and manually name your slices. But we had already discussed that if you do name your slices, then you can actually control that, so this would not come into play. However, if you kind of leave those fields blank, Illustrator will automatically name the slices based on the way that things are listed right here. Let's go to the next tab over here where it says Background, and we'll see that we have the ability to choose a path for an image that might be used as the background for this HTML page. Finally, we also have a setting here called Saving Files, and this allows us to specifically control how Illustrator saves these files. For example, we can choose file naming here, which I find somewhat interesting because we have settings here, for example, like trigger name or rollover state, and haha, wouldn't you believe it, the Illustrator program has no ability to create rollovers. This is obviously here because, like I said before, this used to be a program called ImageReady, and this same code or the same plugin is actually shared with Photoshop, which does support rollovers. So that's why these settings are here. Still, you have complete control over how these files are named. You can choose file name compatibility, which I usually set to Unix because 9 times out of 10, the web servers that I'm using are Unix-based. And then you can choose exactly where your optimized files are saved. Now, by default, Illustrator creates a folder called Images where it stores all of your images. However, you may choose to uncheck that so that your images are saved in a location that you want without being put inside of one standard folder called Images. Finally, in the bottom here, there's an option that allows you to include XMP, which is metadata in a file. But know that if you include the metadata, that obviously adds to the file size of your artwork. So for example, if you were exporting a JPEG and you wanted to include maybe copyright information inside of that, you can include that XMP information. However, that will add to the file size of the JPEG file. Finally, one of the nice things to note here is that you have the ability to save all these settings and then load them at a later time. This means that, for example, if you have a developer you're working with or if you have a certain workflow for a particular client, you can save all these settings and then load them as necessary. Once you have all the settings the way that you want, you would click OK. Then you're returning back to the Save Optimized As dialog box where you would click Save to save your files using all the settings that you've just specified.